Really, it's a great honor to be with you this evening, this afternoon. And really, the folks from St. Luke's, is it St. Luke? I always say St. Luke or St. I'll read it here, St. Luke's Wood River Foundation. Actually, I met some of the key individuals from that organization at a conference I spoke at on philanthropy, as we've talked about. And the reason I was at that conference was to speak to the value proposition of how being generous can have a profound impact on one's life. And as part of that conversation, I was asked to tell a little bit about my own story, because my trajectory is not the typical one to get to where I'm at today. I actually grew up in poverty. My father was an alcoholic. My mother was paralyzed from a stroke. She also had a seizure disorder, and she was chronically depressed. And we were on public assistance. Neither of my parents went to college. And as a child, it always interested me because I was involved with a lot of public organizations as a beneficiary. I also saw my father go to jail, my mother go to the hospital numerous times. And it was very painful. When you grow up in poverty, a couple things happen. If you're a child, you wonder why you're having to live that experience, and oftentimes you translate into you're living that experience because somehow you did something. The other side is that when you don't have mentors, if you don't have access, you don't see any way out from your situation, it's extraordinarily depressing. You lose your dignity. Oftentimes you're not treated particularly well. I remember going to the emergency department and hearing doctors make negative comments because we didn't have insurance, or my mother had tried to commit suicide, and wondering why that experience was happening to me, and also why it was happening to my parents, my brother and sister. And you know, when you're in a situation where there's hopelessness, despair, you don't think there's a way out. If you don't think there's a way out or there's any opportunity, oftentimes people engage in negative behaviors. Because if there's no place to go, it's not unusual to hide your pain or your suffering by taking drugs or trying to dull the pain with narcotics or whatever. So by the age of 13, although I was a bright student, I was already engaging in some of these behaviors, and I was becoming a juvenile delinquent. And an interesting thing happened. I walked into a magic shop. Now, the interesting thing about that was the owner of the magic shop wasn't there, but his mother was there. And I described this woman as being in her 50s. If any of you lived during the 60s, you know what I mean by a 60s Earth Mother type. And she was in this bright, flowing dress and long, wavy hair, and she had this infectious smile and this generosity of spirit. And she started talking to me, and she told me her son wasn't there who ran the store, and she knew nothing about magic. But we engaged in a conversation. She said, you know, I'm here for the summer. I'm here for 6 weeks. I think I can teach you something that could change your life. Now, I wish I could tell you at that time I had some incredible insight into what she meant, but frankly, I had nothing else to do, and I showed up. And the time we spent together was actually quite extraordinary. You know, prior to this interaction, I tell people that I felt like a leaf being blown by an ill wind. I had no control. I went here, I went there, I didn't know what was going to happen tomorrow. I didn't know where I would land. We'd been evicted from houses, apartments. My father didn't have a job. He had been arrested. My mother had been in the hospital at different periods of time. So it was a very chaotic life. So when I began this interaction with this woman, I tell people I felt that I had few, if any, possibilities, that I didn't think I had a future. Now, I had seen a doctor when I was in 4th grade who was a wonderful person. He came and spoke to my class, and I'd said I wanted to be like him, but I didn't know what that meant or possibly how to even get there. So anyway, I spent time with this woman, and she taught me a mindfulness or meditation practice combined with a visualization technique and the power of positive thinking. And at the end of that, I had a transformative experience. In fact, I tell people that this was my first experience with neuroplasticity, how you can change your brain. I went from a perception of having no possibilities to actually having unlimited possibilities. And it's amazing what happens when you change the way you think, because the whole world opens up to you. I give an example that isn't it extraordinary how 2 people can walk out a door into the rain. One can sit there and say, this is horrible, you know, it's getting my suit wet, the traffic's going to be horrible, I'm going to be late to my meeting, this just sucks. Then you'll have another person walk out into the exact same event, and you'll say, this is amazing, there's been a drought, the rain is so warm on my body, it makes me feel alive. I know that this water is going to make the roots grow, the trees have fruit. This is extraordinary, I am so blessed. Yet they both experienced the exact same thing. And that interaction with that person changed fundamentally my life. And in fact, to tell you the rest of the story very quickly, before we start talking about science, is the way this technique works, this visualization or this mindfulness, is that, you know, you can visualize from going from point A to point B, but it's not always the straight path you end up, even though you ultimately get there. And I'll give you an example. So I wanted to go to college. Well, I had no mentors. I had no clue how to even apply to college. And I was in a science class, and I was sitting next to a girl, a pretty girl. And I was talking to her, and she was filling out her application. And I said, what are you doing? She said, well, I'm completing my application. It's due Friday. It was like Tuesday. I go, really? I said, well, where are you going to college? And she said, UC Irvine. I said, and she said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to UC Irvine. And she said, well, I have an extra application. And she helped me fill out the application. I turned it on time. And that was the only school I applied to. But, you know, when I got there, I was completely ill-prepared for college. And it was not only I was ill-prepared for college, but because of the nature of my personal situation, I ended up having to leave to take care of complex family situations. I flunked out of school. And in fact, I was asked to leave. I refused to leave. And then what happened is I decided, of course, I'd set to be a doctor. And again, and I know this may sound extraordinary, but I really had no understanding of this process. And I must have been the most naive person in the world. And so with all these struggles to stay in school, and I had a full-time job, it came time to apply to med school. And at that time, the application process, the average GPA of a student applying to medical school who got accepted was 3.79. That's an A- average, right? How many of you had 3.79s or above in college? Well, okay. Actually, I'm not like George Bush because I certainly respect hard work and intellect. You know, I don't think that necessarily having a C average is the best thing in the world, especially if you're a brain surgeon. But, but anyway, so it came time to apply to med school, and my GPA was 2.53. And it turned out that my school had something called a pre-med committee. You had to actually go in front of them and have an interview, and they would write you a letter of recommendation. So again, in my complete naivete, I went to get this appointment. And do you know what they told me? They said, interviewing you is a waste of our time. A waste of our time. Now, who has the right to say that to anybody? So, my comment was, I'm not leaving here until you give me an appointment. I just sat down in the middle of the thing. And I refused, and I sat there for a few hours. And they realized I wasn't going to leave, so they actually gave me an appointment. Now, imagine how pleasant it is to walk into a room of 3 professors who, do you think they had a predetermined idea of what they were going to do when I walked in like this? And the unfortunate thing, though, is oftentimes decisions are made based on numbers that have no meaning. And this is a quick way to get rid of people or to make judgments about people. But until you know somebody, you don't know anything about them, and a number doesn't answer that question. So I spent the next hour before they even started asking them who gave them the right or authority to destroy people's dreams. Because I'm not aware that there is such a place. And what I did was I changed the conversation from looking at a GPA to looking at a person. There's a big difference. At the end of our conversation, which was somewhat one-sided, they were all crying. And they ended up actually giving me the highest recommendation they could give. Because as I explained to them, there's not one shred of evidence that beyond an above average level of intelligence has any impact on your success as a physician. None, not a bit. Yet this is the criteria that they use to determine people's futures. Now you can make up all the excuses, well, we don't have time, da-da-da-da-da. Well, you need to take time, because people are not numbers. So anyway, as I was leaving this wonderful interview, there was a brochure on the wall, and it was from a medical school called Tulane. And it advertised a summer research enrichment program for socioeconomically disadvantaged students and minorities. The only problem was the deadline expired. So I called the lady up and convinced her to let me into this program. And she did. So guess how many medical schools I applied to? So I applied to one. I was accepted to one with a 2.53 GPA, and I didn't even get a degree. I didn't get an undergraduate degree. And boy, my life has sure sucked since then, hasn't it? All those predictors of success had absolutely zero meaning. What has meaning is persistence, what we call grit, determination, effort. And in fact, so I did graduate from that medical school. And after Hurricane Katrina, when they lost their dean, because he actually went into a depression, they moved the medical school to, they were in New Orleans. They moved the medical school to Houston. They had the library destroyed. They were trying to find a dean to replace this one, but he wanted an endowed chair. So I endowed his chair, redid the library, and set up a multi-million-dollar scholarship for students who are going into service to others. And I think I'm probably the largest donor to the medical school at Tulane of any graduate. And so it shows you can never predict what the future holds, what one individual can do or contribute based on superficial criteria. each of us has within our hearts the ability to impact other individuals. It has nothing to do with position. It has nothing to do with wealth. What's interesting, though, is there is a paradox here. As a child, it used to amaze me that I would see people who were in that situation and would see me or others suffering and either walk by or do absolutely nothing. Then you would see people who had extreme poverty who would do anything. And it's an amazing paradox, and it's one that stuck with me. Well, I won't bore you with other details of my life, but except that I did end up doing okay in medical school. I spent 9 years in the Army I was trained in neurosurgery. And then I became an entrepreneur, and I was involved in the .com thing and made tens and tens of millions of dollars. Was driving a Ferrari, had a penthouse on the top of a building, a villa in Florence, was buying an island in New Zealand, was hanging out with the rich and famous. And I thought naively that, wow, this is great. I've reached the pinnacle of success. Yet there was a problem. And the problem is I, if you will, was nourishing myself on things that had didn't provide sustenance. They had no nutritional value. It was a hollow existence. And deep down inside, I was still hungry. And I didn't know this until in 6 weeks, I lost tens of millions of dollars, had to sell everything, and was effectively bankrupt. And I had made some decisions to donate some money to charity, but I had nothing left. And I truly did lose everything. But it made me reflect a little bit. And in fact, it actually liberated me. I realized that all of those things didn't define who I was, that I, in fact, was extraordinarily blessed. I mean, my worst day is I'm a neurosurgeon at Stanford, and I make more money than 99.9% of people in the world. I mean, I'm not starving in any way. My lifestyle wasn't changed. But the other liberating thing was that I had made these obligations to charity, but and I had no more assets except stock in a company that I had been the CEO of and had saved, a medical device company. So I wanted to live up to those commitments. I had nothing left. I gave all that stock away. And that stock that I gave away when that company went public for $1.3 billion ended up being a lot of money. And then it allowed me to, and I had given it away to foundations and charities, but it allowed me to have a profound impact in a different variety of domains. But it was also the most wonderful thing in the world because it liberated me from a feeling that I needed to have control and that money gave me control. And the reality is I realized, first of all, none of us have any control. Second, that while money is wonderful for some things, for many people it's a prison, and it actually makes their life not one of joy, but it makes them a life of oftentimes fear or anxiety, or makes them search around trying to engage in experiences, oftentimes with others in that same boat, yet they're still impoverished in many ways. So giving everything away was an incredible experience. But I got back to this question of, because I also wanted to understand what gives individuals meaning. And so I was back at Stanford by this time, and I said, I want to understand this paradox of why some people don't recognize the suffering of others, and others intervene and do something. Some are generous, some are not. So I began some explorations with neuroscientists and psychologists. And then it popped into my head one day, wouldn't it be wonderful to have the Dalai Lama come and speak at Stanford? Now, I had no connection to the Dalai Lama. Frankly, I'm not religious at all. I can't tell you why that popped into my head. Obviously, the Dalai Lama is an iconic figure who, by most people's estimates, is one of the most well-respected people in the world. So I finagled a meeting with him. And so I had this meeting and to ask him to come to Stanford. And so at this meeting, he and I began this dialogue. He immediately agreed to come. What's extraordinary is that when he said, well, let's pick a date, I thought there was some secretary who would come out with a computer, right, and type in it. This monk comes out with this ledger. But we picked a date. And I was just, wow, this is incredible. And to be in the presence of someone like this was actually extraordinary. And I'll tell you why. Because when you're in the presence of this gentleman, an extraordinary thing happens. What happens is that the armor that we carry around with us, the armor that we think protects us from other people or from being hurt, which is this thing we carry that doesn't let people hurt us or gives this projection that I have my act together, I'm cool, I'm not in pain or anything. It takes an immense amount of psychic energy to hold that. When you're with this fellow, it immediately goes away, and believe it or not, you're embraced by love. It's the most extraordinary experience. If you've ever seen anybody interact directly with the Dalai Lama, it is an amazing experience. So anyway, at the end of our meeting, which went far beyond what it was supposed to, he begins this animated conversation with his private secretary and translator in Tibetan. And I'm going, oh my God, did I piss off the Dalai Lama? He's not talking in English. And my wife is Russian. When she doesn't talk in English to me and is talking to her mother, I know something's going on, right? But at the end of it, the translator said, Jim, His Holiness is so impressed by this endeavor you've begun, he wants to make a donation. He made, at that meeting, the largest donation he's ever given to a non-Tibetan cause at that single meeting. And subsequent to that, he and I have, if I can say, have become friends. And I've had a number of close, personal, direct interactions with him, and it's profoundly affected how I view the world. And it certainly contributed to this work. And from that interaction led others to display generosity, which created the center at Stanford. And we examined the neuroscience of compassion and the value proposition of being compassionate. Now, some people will sit there and go, oh, compassion, I don't want to hear that. That's sort of the soft stuff, and wimps talk about that. In fact, I saw a cartoon that showed two people on Wall Street talking. And the guy said, compassion, that's just another word for socialism. And it's really not. The amazing thing that I have learned on this endeavor is really the power of compassion. The Dalai Lama says, being compassionate is one of the few instances where it's a good thing to be selfish. And the reason he says that is because when you care for others, are in service to others, or give to others, it has a profound positive effect on you. And in fact, science has borne this out. For individuals who, if you will, are compassionate with intent, it has a huge effect on their mental state, it has a huge effect on their physical state, and it has an effect on their longevity. And in fact, there is a genetic component to compassionate behavior. Now, why is that? Why is it inherently contained within us on actually a genetic level to be compassionate? And the reason that is the case is because if you look at the evolution of our species, and I know we're in a church and some people may not believe evolution, or the 6,000-year period. If you look at the evolution of our species, To have something we call theory of mind, to have the ability to abstract think, to have complex language, required enlargement of our cerebral cortex and a prolonged gestational period, a small litter, and the requirement that our offspring are cared for about 15 years or longer, in my case 30 apparently. But unlike other species where the child is delivered or the litter occurs and the offspring just run off and they're completely self-sufficient, humans have an absolute requirement that their offspring be cared for a decade and a half, oftentimes, or longer, or they will not survive. And in a harsh environment, this was absolutely critical. So to have that occur, because the cost of that type of caring is extraordinarily expensive in terms of resources, we developed these very strong, nurturing, bonding pathways within us that allow us to look at someone and see their suffering, your child, and respond to that suffering, even potentially at a cost to yourself. I mean, mothers and parents will sacrifice themselves to care for their offspring. As we evolve further as a species, remember until 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, our primary survival strategy was as hunter or gatherers. That was till 6 to kind, open, loving people. And then over here we have sociopaths and Wall Street banker. I didn't really mean that. Well, sort of I did. Well, the reason I say that is actually, you know, there's a revolution going on. And how many have heard of mindfulness in this room? In fact, it was on the front page of the cover of the Times recently. It's a mindfulness revolution. And mindfulness is wonderful. This is a technique that can, and it's a mind training, it can be transformative. And what does it do? What it does is, and it allows you to not respond to the noise that's going on in your head and become emotionally engaged with that. What does that mean? We are the most evolved species on this planet so far. Now, you could argue we're the least evolved since we kill each other for no reason and steal and create heinous crimes for no reason, and no other animal does that. But beyond that, theoretically, we're the most evolved species. Yet, and the reason, one of the things about that evolution is that we have a perception of a past and a perception of a future. Now, what does that do to us? When you have a perception of a past, how many of you sit and say, shoot, I wish I had done this, I really screwed up, gosh, I did the wrong thing. Has anybody ever done that? And then the other thing that happens is what am I going to do tomorrow? So you're in a conversation with somebody, and you're not in a conversation with them, you're sitting there in front of them, and you're going, well, shoot, I have to do this tomorrow, I have to turn this, I have this deadline. So a study was done that showed for most people, 80% of the time, they're not here, they're over there or over there, 80% of the time. And what mindfulness does is it allows you to think clearly, not respond to these other things that are going on, especially self-critical things. And it can have the impact of lowering blood pressure and some of these other benefits because you're not having anxiety or fear either about events that have happened in the past or uncertainty of what's going to happen in the future. So it's wonderful. But there's a danger here. And when you do this, in some ways it's a journey of one, right? You're inside yourself, and while you may meditate with other people, it's still an inward journey. And the danger is as follows. When this was secularized and taken from a Tibetan Buddhist practice, the compassion component and the wisdom and insight component was removed. And in fact, I'll give you an example of what's happened to it. There was just an article in the Wall Street Journal saying how hedge fund managers are now promoting mindfulness. Now, not in what part of that article did it say they're promoting this so they can be more thoughtful and care for others? Not a word. There was not a word about we're making these absolutely obscene amounts of money at the expense of others, but we're going to give it all away. Not a word. The compassion word was not used at all. This was simply a technique to become more efficient and more focused. And for the type A types, it allows you to become more self-absorbed, more narcissistic, more selfish. The thing, though, that most of us want in our lives is what? We want our lives to have meaning. We want to be able to be in a position at the end of the day to say, my life had meaning, it had purpose, I was here for a reason. To have that happen, it is not an inward journey alone. To have transcendence, to recognize your purpose in this world, to have meaning in your life, it is an outward journey, and it is a journey that is not done alone. It is a recognition that your brother, your sister, your children, your wife, your parents, they are not just your family. The world is your family. All of humanity is your family. Your home is not just where your house is. Your home is the world. It is that recognition, it is that understanding that service to others, caring for others, embracing others with love is what ultimately is going to be what allows our species to survive. I heard something. Is there something over there? You're supposed to clap uproariously here. I gave a talk I told you I went to medical school at Tulane. Before the medical students actually start medical school, and I'll conclude with this, they're given a white coat. Have any of you heard of this? It's called the white coat ceremony. So this is all done at almost every medical school nowadays. So the medical students, before medical school starts, usually the weekend before they get a white coat, they take the oath of Hippocrates or some other appropriate oath. And then they have an inspirational speaker who epitomizes the highest ideals of medicine. So I was that person in my medical school, which was an incredible honor for me. And I gave actually about an hour and a half talk to the medical students, but the key part of that talk was as follows. One is, if we think that science and technology is going to solve all of humanity's problems, we are going to be sadly disappointed. Even in my profession as a brain surgeon, neurosurgeon, I will tell you that even though my profession requires I use some very extraordinarily sophisticated pieces of equipment, my successes occur, my positive outcomes are just as much because I have demonstrated caring and kindness. All the science and technology in the world do not soothe a child who is crying in pain. It doesn't soothe a person who is dying. It is the human touch. It is the human connection that does that. As part of that same discussion with the medical students, I said, like in medical school, you have to remember a lot of things. So there's certain tools we use, mnemonics. How many of you have used mnemonics to remember things, right? Very common thing. I said, the mnemonic that I use to keep me centered as a human being and as a physician is part of the alphabet. And it's as follows. It is C through L. It starts with compassion. Compassion for self and compassion for others. You know, in Western society, we have a tendency to beat up on ourselves, to say we're not good enough, we haven't performed enough, and people repeat this message to themselves. When in fact, every human being is frail and fragile, and for most people, they're trying to do their best they can, and most people are extraordinarily good people. You don't have to beat up on yourself. And until you can release yourself, it's very hard to be compassionate to others because you're distracted by your own pain. D is recognizing the dignity of every person. Every person has the right to be heard. Every person has the right to be identified and recognized as a human being. F is forgiveness. You know, all of us have, believe it or not, none of us are perfect, and all of us have wronged others, and we have been wronged. And for many people, though, it's very difficult to forgive individuals. I mean, all of you know stories who somebody, a close friend did something, and they haven't spoken to each other for 20 years. And these people who are like incredibly close, or a family member who did something, and then they never speak to them again. The problem with anger and hostility when you think you've been wronged is that it's like drinking poison and somehow thinking it's going to have an effect on the other person. It does nothing. And it locks you in an emotional negative state. And until you release that and go forward, you're locked in. You cannot progress as a human being when you hold that type of anger for a long period of time. G is gratitude. You know, I live in Silicon Valley, an extraordinarily affluent area, and it amazes me. I have acknowledged to you, I'm extraordinarily blessed. I get paid more than 99% of the people in the world. I have an incredible job. Yet I have people who are far, far wealthier than I. And instead of looking down and going, God, look at how many people have so much less than I. It's incredible that I'm in this position. I'm so thankful. They sit there and they look up and they go, you know, so-and-so lives in this bigger house. So-and-so is flying a jet that's bigger than my jet. And it is the most extraordinary thing in the world. So gratitude. H is for humility, and as a neurosurgeon, I'll tell you that's the hardest thing in the world. You know, I can always tell a good doctor. Do you know how you can tell a good doctor? When you walk into the hospital, what does he do? He acknowledges every person. He knows the people who empty the trash cans. He knows the people who clean the floors. He acknowledges them, says hello to them. And he actually talks to the patients and touches them. You know, I was, at one time, ran a neuroscience institute, and I was leaving. And I had told everyone I was leaving, and I was interviewing somebody to take my job. So and you know, some of you have heard of the brusque, rude, arrogant neurosurgeon. Have you ever heard of that? So I interviewed this guy. So we walked through the hospital. We entered the hospital to the information desk. The woman behind the information says, Dr. Doty, it's so great to see you. You know, my husband and I were just talking to you the other day. Can I give you a hug? So I give the lady a hug. We walk over to the cafeteria to have coffee. Sit down. One of the women who works there runs over to me. She says, Dr. Doty, I have this latte for you. You know, thank you so much for taking care of my father. I really appreciate it. And anytime you come in here, we go to radiology. The technician comes up and she says, Dr. Doty, thank you so much for that gift you gave for the baby. She just had a baby. So this proceeds on. So at the end of this hour and a half tour, what do you think the doctor I was interviewing said to me? What the F was wrong with these people? Can you imagine? That was his view of his interaction with people. What is wrong with these nutty people who are actually demonstrating love kindness to you, and you had demonstrated it to them. I said, well, it's interesting. I function in the world through kindness, respect, and serving others. I said, how do you get things done? Because it sort of interests me if that's sort of your attitude. He said, well, I'm the boss, and I say shit, and they say where and how much. I said, well, you're looking for a job. That doesn't seem to be a particularly good strategy, does it? And I said, and you're not going to get this job. But it was extraordinary. Can you imagine? But this is the mindset you sometimes see with people. They have absolutely no clue. Now, I went out of my way to spend some time with this individual to understand his worldview. And, and this is one of the things that you realize, I sometimes say all of us in our lives have wounds of the heart. And for most of us, they heal quickly, and you don't have any pain from them. But for some people, they have very deep wounds, and they continue to cause them pain throughout their lives. And they never address that pain. And all of these events that we oftentimes think of as external events, war, ecological destruction, climate change, these are not external problems. These are problems of the human heart. And when you give people the tools to heal those wounds, it has a profound, profound effect on them. This individual, after I spoke to him, he was turned away by his parents. He was in an orphanage or a home. He was beaten up. He overcame many odds. But his view of how to overcome them was, I always have to fight, I can't trust anybody, and everybody is in opposition to me, and I have to show my authority to get things done because somebody's going to hurt me. Now, I could have been very mad at this individual, but people don't act bad because they're inherently bad. Generally, they act bad because of just what I said. Something has hurt them deeply. Because I told you, our default mode is to be kind and to care, to love, to embrace. So one of the things I'm interested in, one of the things we do at our center, is actually create tools that allow people to do that. Well, I think I'm just about at my time. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I appreciate your time. Thank you. There's not a single question. Thank you. Okay, young lady. Oh, shoot. I always do that because I want to see if somebody's actually listening. So she's the only person listening. So where were we? Humility. The other is integrity, or having personal values. And, especially medical students, I tell them, hang on to your integrity, because as soon as you start compromising even a little bit, you start heading down a slippery slope where it gets easier and easier. And I have certainly personally seen this over and over again, where somebody wakes up and they've committed despicable acts, and it all started out by just doing one thing that compromised their values. Then H-I-J. J is justice. Each of us is in a unique position to be a protector of someone. And this gets into the context of social justice, or recognizing your own ability to care for, protect someone who is vulnerable. K is the active component of compassion. Compassion scientifically is defined as the recognition of another's suffering with a desire to intervene. is not an intervention per se. Kindness is the active component of compassion, if you will. And all of this is held together with love. So that's the... E. Damn it! I don't even know the alphabet. I didn't graduate from college. This is what happens. E. Equanimity. And what I mean by equanimity, in all of our lives, we have ups and downs. That's just the nature of our human experience. What happens, though, for many of us is that when we have an up, what do you want to do? You want to hold on to that, don't you? Because it feels so good. You want to continue that experience, but it never lasts. And the opposite is also true. When you have a downward part of your life where it's difficult, it's hard, it's painful, you don't want to hold on, you wish it will end. But the reality is, that is the way it is. The key, though, is not to get lost by emotionally attaching to either of them. So as an example, if I have a wonderful thing happen to me and I'm riding high and I'm thinking, boy, everything's going together, well, there are a couple things that always happen. I know it's not going to last. Because as soon as I get arrogant and start thinking, this is great, I'm so great, everything's going to work out for me, and although I'm an atheist, I always say, God is going to punish me. And invariably something happens which reminds me of my own imperfections and that it doesn't last, and I'm not, frankly, that great. So having emotion regulation where you don't get lost in either is equanimity. And that's something I try to practice, and I think it's very important. I'll tell you a story real quick to keep talking if you'd like. Do any of you know Deepak Chopra? Yes. What a twit. No, I'm just kidding. So Deepak's a friend of mine. So I'm at a conference with Deepak. He says, Jim, I want you to come down and talk at the Sages and Scientists conference that he has. And I go, well, which of mine? He says, well, I don't know yet. I said, what do you want me to talk about? He says, I don't know yet. I go, okay. So I show up, and it turns out it's a conference on quantum consciousness. Do you guys all know what quantum consciousness is? I sure as hell don't. So I'm there at this conference, and it's a 2-day conference. So day 1 passes, and he doesn't ask me to talk. We're halfway through day 2. He doesn't ask me to talk, and I go, it's lunchtime. I go, Deepak, you know, I don't mind not talking. He says, oh, no, Jim, I found the perfect place for you. I go, really? And he goes, yeah, I think you should just be the last speaker and summarize everything. How is this even possible that you would do that to me? So I get in front of this group of people, and I said, well, you know, I know nothing about quantum physics. I know nothing about quantum consciousness. I know nothing about particle entanglement. But I do know we are all entangled, and that entanglement is love. And then that allowed me to go off into something. So then Deepak calls me up and he says, Jim, he says, you know, I'm doing this event with Cory Booker over in New Jersey, and the Dalai Lama and Robert Thurman, who's Uma Thurman's father, and I decided I want you to come and speak, and it's on education and peace, okay? And he says, I go, well, what do you want me to talk about? He says, well, I want you to run a workshop on peace through compassion. Well, I know nothing about that, but I can talk about anything for 20 or 30 minutes. So I said, well, how many people? He said, it'll be about 20 people. And I said, how long's the workshop? About 40 minutes. I go, oh, great, no problem. And I had to go to New York, and they were paying for it, so I go, this is great. I get a free trip. I get to see the Dalai Lama again, and some of my friends. So I show up, and it's 5 o'clock the night before this event's going to happen in the morning. So the person at the registration says, oh, you're Dr. Doty, this is great. We have great news for you. I go, really? What is it? They go, you know, we have decided that you're going to follow the Dalai Lama, and you have an hour and a half. I stood there like completely dumbfounded. Like, this is a joke, right? And so the reason I'm actually able to stand in front of you and ramble on is because after that experience, I realized I have about an hour and a half of stuff, and I'm like a comedian, so I always hold about an hour and a half. So we're at about an hour and 10. I have 20 more minutes of stuff left if we have to go. Are there any more questions? Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if I was curious about the techniques that you guys are cultivating and where I could go to learn more about those specific techniques.
So we have a very robust website. It's ccare.stanford.edu, and it's ccare.stanford.edu. So ccare, so the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. So there are all sorts of resources there. It shows our science research, and there are 3 parts to what we do. One is the science, so it's pure, really hardcore science. One is what we call the interventions, which is what you're talking about, and we have developed a compassion cultivation training program. It's an 8-week program, and it allows people, if you will, to go through this process of learning attention and focus, self-compassion, compassion for others, and sort of looking at the world a different way. And it's really had a profound effect on a lot of people. We've actually done research studies on that. We also have other techniques. There's a technique developed by Paul Gilbert called compassion-focused therapy. And so that's our intervention, our educational part. And then we have a part that we put on conferences, seminars. We run a Science of Compassion academic conference every 2 years, alternating with a Science of Compassion Summer Research Institute for graduate and postdoctoral students where we bring together the leading scientists to go over the latest research and to interact with students. And then we also have a variety of events. We put on films that relate to this topic. And then there's another thing which I actually is one of the funnest things that I do. And it's really quite selfish. I freely admit it. And I do a thing called Conversations on Compassion. And have any of you seen Charlie Rose? So it's actually a Charlie Rose type. So 2 people sit on a stage and talk for an hour and a half. And so I do that with interesting people who I want to learn about or hang out with. And I always give them some excuse to come. And it's really quite wonderful. So people we've had, and all these are on YouTube. All my talks, all this stuff is on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel. So we've had, do any of you know Thich Nhat Hanh? Eckhart Tolle? Sri Sri Ravi Shankar? Amma, the hugging guru? Oh, she's interesting. Anyway, so these are spiritual leaders, and I tell you I'm an atheist, but for some reason I have this bizarre interaction and relationship with all these spiritual leaders. I don't get it, and I don't even question it. But I have wonderful times with these people. I have personal relationships, and you'll see the playfulness and fun in these conversations. Plus, they're business leaders. Steve Luzow, head of Seagate, largest disk drive maker in the world. Scott Kreens, chairman of Juniper Networks, multi-billion-dollar company. We're soon going to have Jeff Weiner of LinkedIn. We have, do any of you know Anna Devere Smith? She's an actress. She'll be coming actually in the next month or 2. But there are a ton of these conversations. They're interesting, a lot of fun. And like I said, for me, they're the most enjoyable part. I get to hang out with them. Yes, ma'am. Don't men have any questions here? Come on. Yes, ma'am. No, there are no real men in this room.
So I was just asking a question about a topic called compassion fatigue, and if you had any thoughts on that.
Sure. In some ways it's empathy fatigue, but yes, of course, I have thoughts on everything. Just ask me a topic, I'll have a thing. Compassion fatigue is certainly common among healthcare workers, especially nurses. One of the challenges, a lot of people who go into the healthcare professions are what? They're givers and they're caretakers. And oftentimes it's because of their background. They've had something in their background that makes them want to care for others. But the problem is that oftentimes they're not very good at setting boundaries for themselves. And then what happens is that they become overwhelmed and they can't say no. And as a result, they get burned out and they can't work. They're ineffective. And this is a very common problem. So a lot of techniques are being developed for this. There's a guy named Charles Figley actually at Tulane. There's a woman whose name I can't recall. She's married to a friend of mine, Phil Zimbardo, the guy who did the prison experiments. I can't remember her name, but she's written quite a bit about this topic. We are actually in the process, and it's not public knowledge yet, creating a Center for Compassionate Healthcare. And in fact, we just founded a journal called the Journal of Compassionate Healthcare. And it'll be coming out, the first issue should be coming out in the next 3 months. And the center is actually to look at a couple sides of this topic. One is these types of issues with healthcare providers and burnout, and to give them tools to how to deal with that, but also to recreate patient-centered care or compassionate-centered care. You know, in 1925, Francis Peabody gave an interesting quote that's just as true now as was then, which is, the care of the patient is actually caring for the patient. And to get back to a situation where there's actually empathy, compassion, sensitivity to the patient. And we know, based on a fair amount of science so far, that you can decrease outcomes in regard to decreasing length of stay, increasing satisfaction, and actually having a very positive effect on healing if actually the doctors and the nurses are kind to the patient. And we just received actually a very large grant from Dignity Health. Have you ever heard of them? Dignity Health used to be Catholic Hospitals West. It's a 5th largest healthcare chain in the United States. It employs about 70,000 people. And they've created a thing called Human Kindness, which is a marketing campaign, but in fact, they came to us to ask us to do some research, but before I agreed to this, I actually met with the CEO and their leadership and said, look, is this a BS marketing campaign? Because nothing hospital administrators like is to create marketing campaigns with no substance. At least that's been my experience sometimes. You know, it's like we'll create the marketing campaign and magically all the other stuff will happen with it, even though we have no doctors engaged, we haven't gotten the nurses on board. Anyway, I met with them and I realized they are serious. So we're actually doing a big study, a meta-analysis and a literature review of how compassion and kindness affect health outcomes. And we're creating actually a website which will disseminate all of this information, and then we're pulling together Dignity Health, Stanford Hospital and Clinic, Stanford School of Medicine, and some other partners actually to create this center that will act as a think tank, a research entity, a translator of research to address some of these issues. So it's actually quite exciting, something I'm very engaged with. I'm looking for a guy here. Now, are the guys just not thinking, or they sleep, or they're just like so burned out hearing all about this compassion stuff? How about this young lady over here? We'll get to all of you.
You mentioned earlier that we tend to spend more time with people who look like us or act like us. And I was wondering if you knew of any scientific evidence that told us why we do that?
Well, it's as I said earlier, and there is a body of science about this. You can look in the work of Dacher Keltner and others. There's a book called The Compassion Instinct, or The Compassionate Instinct. But because it's like hanging out with people who are part of your tribe. Your anxiety decreases and you feel safe. And that's just a part of our evolution. Yes, ma'am.
Curious, I've been following a lot of your online talks and things for the last couple of years. And one that
Well, thank you.
I'm just drawn to over and over is that AB course. And I actually called and the lady I spoke to said, you know, we don't have anything online. And I said, I would love to fly down there every Wednesday, but I don't.
No, I understand. We are actually creating an online course. And if you can get actually enough people together, we can send somebody up to do that. We've sent people to different parts of the world to actually do it like in a 1 week period of time or something. Yes, ma'am. That's you.
It seems to me that the greatest hope for saving mankind would be to have an intervention with children before, we're all as adults open and, learning all this new information and mindfulness and stuff. But it seems like it would be a lot more effective to start teaching the children these things. I'm just curious if you are reaching out to that.
Yes, there are a variety of programs that are happening. The problem is that most of them are not, have no science behind them. There's somebody's perception that it works. We're actually doing a pilot with actually the Louisville, Kentucky school system, and I'm hoping to have it done in Oakland and San Francisco. And you probably say, why Louisville, Kentucky? It turns out that the mayor of Louisville is probably the most compassionate mayor in the world. He is actually leading a compassionate cities movement to imbue every part of how the city functions with compassion, both on the individual level, the educational system, the healthcare system, the justice system, the police department, the juvenile justice system, the prison system, as well as civic government and the business aspect. And there's something, have any of you heard of the Charter for Compassion? This was something started by Karen Armstrong. She's a former nun who has written a ton on religion. And she won the TED Prize. Any of you listen to TED Talks? She won the TED Prize in '08, and her TED wish was to create the Charter of Compassion. She got together with 19 religious leaders and one atheist, and created a charter for compassion, and with all these components. I'm actually on the board of trustees, and one of our big initiatives is the Compassionate Cities movement. And Ketchum or Sun Valley could become a compassionate city, and there's a process to do that. But it's to engage at the level of wanting to change how your civic government works and how the citizenry look at their responsibility in terms of concern for the most vulnerable, volunteerism, educating youth, all sorts of things. And I understand you do have an educational program here, which is just wonderful, and I congratulate you on that. Yes, yes, sir. Oh my gosh. I saw him earlier, and I knew he was the most compassionate guy in this room.
What was the key moment in your life that led you to be a compassionate person?
Well, I would have to tell you that I was, frankly, always a reasonably nice guy. And I don't say that to pat myself on the back, but the reason I was that way was because seeing people suffer was personally very painful, even as a child. And, I used to be the kid who, if somebody was getting beaten up, would always intervene, even though I was smaller sometimes. So, for me, it was always there. And sometimes being that way was extraordinarily painful, because I would get in fights a lot. So it wasn't anything as far as being a compassionate doctor, but I can innately tell you that it has a huge impact on people. Even as a neurosurgeon, I'll give you an example real quick if I can bore you with another story. Do you know how many people I see? Patient comes in to see me, as an example, with back pain. Most have already been scheduled for surgery by somebody else, or they want another opinion. I ask them, I say, how long did the doctor spend with you? Do you know what the average is? 10 minutes. Here, a doctor is going to intervene and do a major surgery, and he spent 10 minutes with the patient. I say, well, what did he find when he examined you? So half of them look at me like, what are you talking about, examine me? Half of the people were not even examined. Now, I can tell you, doing what I do is complex work. Pain is a complex problem. It takes for me to understand and listen to a person. I mean, listen to a person, which means you're not distracted, you're not rushing to get out of the room. You have a sincere interest in what that person has to say. You examine all of the x-rays intently. You explain the situation to them. You get an understanding of their lifestyle and what they need to function in the way they function. It takes me about an hour. How is it possible that a guy can see somebody in 10 minutes to do a major intervention on somebody's life? This is the problem with healthcare. I'll give you an example. I saw a woman in her late 20s, obese woman. She came and saw me, and she said, I have horrible back pain. I'm scheduled for surgery. And I wanted another opinion. Somebody said, I should see you. And, I looked at this girl. She won't look me directly in the eye. Her hair is covering her eyes. I sit with her. I look at her films. She has a little bulge in her spine. A guy wants to fuse her. I examine her. She has no hard findings. So I sit with her. I say, tell me about your life. When did this all start? She said, I've had back pain since I was 12. And it's been horrible. And this is associated with pain while she has sex. I go, oh, okay. What happened to you when you were 12? What happened to her? Was that her parents divorced, her mother remarried, and her stepfather raped her. And since that time, she's had horrible pain. So do you think the back operation was going to help her? No. So I hooked her up with a psychiatrist, and she, when we went through that, she broke down and cried. She thanked me. I was the only doctor who ever asked her, the only doctor in her entire trajectory in the medical profession, the medical arena, who took the time to sit with her to understand. That is the problem with medicine today. Now, I saw this girl after this was a cathartic experience. She got to see a psychiatrist. I saw her again. She had lost about 60 pounds, had a job, and no more back pain. That's practicing medicine. Well, I've taken up way too much time. Thank you so much. It's really a joy and an honor to be with you. Take care.
Thank you.